It is like every Sunday, good to be here this Sunday morning. It's good to see everybody here. And for any of our guests, we definitely encourage you to come back every chance you get. We do thank you for coming. This time of year, the world looks at a new birth, looks at a child of promise. And so that is what I'll do as well for this morning's sermon, is the child of promise. There was something promised to the world quite a few years ago, probably roughly 2,700, give or take a couple years. This promise was made. Isaiah is where we will begin this morning. If you'd like to turn that direction, we'll spend a little bit of time there looking at a few of the points he makes. But we look at, in the world today, when something sounds too good to be true, it usually is. You know, you get that letter in the mail, or most by email, that says a Nigerian prince has died and has millions and wants to give it all to you. Send us $500 to process it, and you'll have $5 million by the end of the week. My reply is just take the 500 out of the 5 million. And if you need an extra 100 for convenience, I'll be generous and give that to you too. Send me the leftovers. They have yet to do that. I guess it's too good to be true. It just hadn't happened yet. So what do we say to this idea that there will be a child born who is more than just a man, who is predicted to come to save the world, pay my debts for me, even the debts I haven't even incurred yet, and he will be the price for my transgressions, with very little asked in return? Sounds a little too good to be true. It sounds like a fairy tale to me, kind of like a little Cinderella type thing. Has put this little glass slipper on. If it was the perfect fit, why'd it fall off? But when we have it and go forward, you will have the perfect night until the clock strikes midnight. Then you're going to go back to your rags and torn up clothes. That's what I'm envisioning here. There's someone coming. He's going to be the greatest thing ever. He's going to take away all the issues of the world. Okay, what's the catch? Well, Isaiah tells us this prediction. Isaiah chapter 49, he starts into this in the first verses. Listen, O isles, unto me, and hearken, ye people from far. The Lord has called me from the womb, from the bowels of my mother has he made mention of my name. And he has made my mouth like a sharp sword, and made me a polished shaft. In his quiver he hath hid me. And he said unto me, Thou art my servant, O Israel, in whom I will be glorified. Isaiah is kind of interesting in the way he writes this, because it somewhat applies to him, but it also somewhat applies to the one to come. So when we look at this, we have to really kind of slow down and look at it a little bit. Just in those 3 verses, we see some very powerful statements from Isaiah. First off, the very first verse, he says, Listen, O isles, unto me, and hearken, ye people from afar. He's not just talking to the people of Israel. He's not just talking to God's chosen people. He is saying this message is open. Everyone, listen. We also see that there is a very distinct plan here. Notice the way he describes all of these things. My mouth like a sharp sword, the shadow of his hand he hid me, made him a polished shaft, in a quiver he hid me. You put an arrow in a shaft for a reason. You make these items for a reason. Hiding something away until the appropriate time for a reason. There's a reason the ice cream cones are sitting in my freezer right now. They're hidden away, waiting for the right time. Right time might be this evening after supper. But they're hidden away. They are prepared for a time. That Oreo didn't just make itself. It was made for a purpose. Sorry, I just transitioned over to Oreos. Those are in the closet, in the pantry. I've got both. I've got ice cream in the freezer and Oreos on the shelf if I want a cold treat or a not cold treat. You now know my two biggest vices. I like those two items. The arrow, the polished shaft, a sharp sword. Each of these items has a very particular purpose, which means they are planned and have an intent to them. There is a focus and a reason. Each was crafted specifically for that different reason, so that they could be pulled out and utilized at the right time. The servant will come to glorify God and utilize their strength in God. Notice the next verses how he says in verse 5, "And now saith the Lord that formed me from the womb to be his servant, to bring Jacob again to him." And not necessarily just Jacob himself as a person, but Jacob the tribe, for the group. "Through Israel be not gathered, yet shall I be glorious in the eyes of the Lord, and my God shall be my strength." Even in the hardships that we see coming forward, that Isaiah also prophesies about, we see that point right there. "I shall be glorious in the eyes of the Lord, and my God shall be my strength." And he said, "It is a light thing that thou should be my servant to raise up the tribes of Jacob, to restore the preserved of Israel. I will also give thee for a light to the Gentiles, that thou mayest be salvation unto the end of the earth." So when he said in verse 1, even people from afar, now he's saying that this will be a light to all peoples. Not just, it is to unite the tribe of Israel back together again and extend beyond. Include all people, the salvation. The Lord is our strength. Do we notice these things? Do we see a parallel in these with what is to come? We have something the people of Isaiah did not have. We have the full written record of everything he said. We also have the prophecies fulfilled, which is where we get to go look in Luke chapter 2. As we look forward into Luke, we see this account of what happens. Before Luke chapter 2, we see that an angel goes before Zechariah and his wife, and they will bear a son. We know him as John. We see the angels come before Mary and before Joseph and say they will have a son. But they're only engaged right now. They're not together yet. They have not known each other in the marital ways. They are not yet there. But we see the announcement of Jesus' coming. We see in Luke chapter 1, starting in verse 26, where he is able to, and in the 6th month of John's being in the womb, the angel Gabriel was sent from God into the city of Galilee named Nazareth to a virgin espoused to a man whose name was Joseph, of the house of David, and the virgin's name was Mary. An angel came to her and said, "Hail, thou art highly favored, and the Lord is with thee." And when she saw him, she was troubled at the saying, and cast her in her mind what manner of salutation this should be. Remember what Isaiah would say is that our strength is in the Lord. Notice that in this one here, thou art highly favored. The Lord is with thee. This woman has strength because of where her heart is. And the angel said to her, "Fear not, Mary, for thou hast found favor with God, and behold, thou shalt conceive in thy womb, bring forth a son, and his name shall be called Jesus." Joseph was told this as well in Matthew chapter 1. His account is over there. And when he found out about Mary being pregnant, he was going to quietly let her go instead of publicly shaming her, but yet was confronted with the angel and says, "No, this is of God." We see as we continue through the verses, Jesus and John in the womb. In Luke chapter 1, starting in verse 39, Mary arose in those days, went to the hill country, to the city of Judah, entered the house of Zacharias, and saluted Elizabeth. And what we see here, it came to pass when Elizabeth heard the salutation of Mary, the babe, John, leapt in her womb. Ladies who have had this, a little baby who won't sit still, sitting down in there, that little thing just a jumping. John recognized Jesus. When that much is there, so much so that when John and Elizabeth got that good news, they heard it. Mary was there with child of Jesus. They leapt for joy in the womb. We get down to verse 57 through 80 and we see the birth of Christ. We see, that was John's birth. John is born from Luke 1, 57 through 80. I include John in here even though Isaiah is prophesying about Jesus, but Jesus doesn't come without an announcement. Before the announcement, the angel Gabriel announced his coming to his parents, to Mary and Joseph. Now John is preparing to come to give announcement to Christ. He comes in this miraculous way, and it's a great study to look at because when Zechariah, it's interesting, Zechariah and Elizabeth questioned their child when Gabriel announced it. Mary questioned, how can this be? But Mary was not struck with any type of side effects of that questioning. Zechariah was struck mute. He was in the temple serving. He had to finish out his term of service and go home and wait until the child was born to get his voice back. Can you imagine being in the temple serving God and all of a sudden you lose your voice because you asked a question? They questioned the power of God versus Mary asked, how can this be so? I have not known a man. I have not done the things that would cause this to happen. There was a difference of questions. But now we have a rejoicing when John comes. All of a sudden Zechariah gets his voice back. And both the husband and the wife are on the same terms as to what the child's name will be. Even though the kinfolk said, you're going to name him what? John, that ain't even any part of our family. That doesn't mean anything to us. What are you going to do that for? And then he gets his voice back and confirms we're naming him John. It's a great study to see all the extra details that are in there, and I encourage it to be taken. But as we go forward, we get into Luke chapter 2. We start into there, and now we get to Jesus' birth. We get to the birth of what we were seeing in Isaiah prophesying that there would come one who could do all of these things. And it came to pass in those days that there was a decree sent out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be taxed. And the taxing or enrollment was first made with Cyrenius, the governor of Syria. And all went to be taxed, every one of them to his own city. Joseph went up from Galilee out of the city of Nazareth to Judea unto the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was house of David of lineage. To be taxed with Mary, his espoused wife, being great with child. She was about to give birth. She could go any time, but they had to go. To be taxed with, so then it was, while they were there in those days accomplished, that she should deliver. And she brought forth her firstborn son and wrapped him in swaddling clothes and laid him in a manger because there was no room for them in the inn. I want to stop and pause right here for a second and look at this right here. Everyone had to go back to their home cities. Imagine everyone that was born in Indianola or had roots here had to come back here for a couple of weeks so that everyone could be counted and give taxes to the government. Where's everyone going to stay? How long before the hotels are all overbooked? How long before everyone's houses are full and there's still people coming in that have to stay someplace so that they can be counted? Mary and Joseph aren't sitting in a barn because they couldn't afford to go to a hotel or an inn. There was no room by the time they got there. So really look at it for what it is. They are in the barn. How many have been in a barn? How many would like to live in a barn? Is it, having a little pocket air freshener ain't going to cut it. It ain't going to overcome all of the production from the animals that are already there. Saying that it's a manger that he was set in is a very nice way of saying their feeding trough. This is where they go to pig out. They set all the food out in this thing, and that's where they eat. We're thinking about giving birth, and we see these pictures of depicting Jesus' birth, and everything is so clean and sterile and beautiful, kind of like it would be in a staged up operating room or something like that. We go to the hospital. The doctors wear gowns and gloves and masks, and we're on a nice clean table. They're in a barn. She gives birth in the hay or whatever it was that was on the floor or in that area. Now, perhaps they had some fresh over on the side and laid something out, so it might still be a little bit cleaner than just sitting them in the slop. Okay, if I was Mary or Joseph, I'm not sure I'd be putting my newborn into slop. I'd want to put a little coat of something down. I might even take my jacket off and give it to the kid. But get the picture of where he's at. We're talking about this, Isaiah says, there will be a child born that will overcome the sins, bring salvation to the world. Where does he get his start? He gets his start in this world as a human in a barn, sleeping in the food trough. I think it's interesting to think about that, stop and think about that for a second, because there's something very significant about it. I'm going to come back to that here in a second, but this is where he was. It wasn't that they couldn't afford to put him someplace better. There was no place better available. Jesus said in his ministries, "For the foxes have dens, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head." He uses a rock as a pillow. Interesting that he starts in a manger. Jesus also said we must be able to humble ourselves. Those who are humbled will be exalted. What's more humble than being born in a barn instead of someplace fancy? Kind of an interesting comparison I started thinking about, maybe some food for thought to think on. But according to the laws, Jesus was to be circumcised and presented at the temple with an appropriate sacrifice. On the 8th day, they are to be circumcised. Since this was also the firstborn of Mary, the male that opened the womb, there was also a sacrifice that had to be made for that, because the male child had to be dedicated to God. How interesting that her first male child, dedicated to God, is the Son of God, dedicated back to the service. Us too, just being children of His, we ought to be dedicated back. They went to provide the appropriate sacrifice, and we see that as we go through. In Luke 2, verse 21, we see the beginning of it. And when 8 days were accomplished for the circumcision of the child, his name was called Jesus, which was so named of the angel before he was conceived in the womb. And then we continue down and see that they were to give that sacrifice as commanded in Leviticus chapter 12. The great significance of all this is Christ would later talk about needing to be born again. We think about his ministries. We think about all this. He is God. Christ is the Son of Man. We see where he created all things. Why did he have to be born? Couldn't he just materialize out of nowhere and just show up and start walking around and giving ministry? Of course he could. But what about the prophecies of Isaiah? The plan, the molding of that shaft for an arrow takes a little bit of time, takes a little bit of work. The shaft process was beginning back then in the prophecies, and now it's ready to be pulled from the quiver. And so he was born as a child. He's able to go through this world as we have, one day at a time. Starting from having to rely on someone else to being able to support himself. He talks about being born again that we should have to do in this life. So he shows us how that's done each step. He shows us that we were born. He grows up honoring mother and father, fulfilling the laws. And then he too was baptized, being able to fulfill all righteousness as he tells us to do. Jesus was born in a barn because there was no room in the inns or anywhere else. He was rejected by his own and had to go to others to find acceptance. When we go someplace, are there any kinfolk we could go to? Is there any place that we could go? No, there's a barn down the street. How many times could Jesus not do something for his own people that outsiders would gladly accept? I think of the Samaritan woman at the well who gladly received his words when his own people wouldn't even listen. Do we have room for him in our hearts, or do we send him down the road? I think a very interesting question to ask sometimes. Are we quick to judge or assume things? If we heard that he was born in a barn and is laid in a food trough, what would our initial thought be about this person or about this family? Oh, they just had him out yonder, out in the field. What, they couldn't afford medical help? They couldn't go to the hospital? What, they don't have someplace nice to put him? He's in swaddling clothing. What, they couldn't afford a baby outfit for him? Oh, I heard she was pregnant before they even got married. Sometimes we don't know all the things. Think of Mary and Joseph. They haven't known each other yet. Maybe there's a reason for those first 3 months of Mary's pregnancy. She went and stayed with Zechariah and Elizabeth. All three of them are described, Zechariah, Elizabeth, and Mary are all described as being godly people, of having favor with God. Maybe there's something there that we should have that kind of a reputation. That when someone is in need of comfort, of support, as Mary would be, think of the culture. Think of it even today still, even though society is changing their views, it's still not socially acceptable. Then it was very not acceptable. If you were pregnant before marriage, that's not good. Joseph was ready to put her away quietly, even though he had all right to do it very publicly and in a shameful way to her. What about those around who saw him staying at the barn? All of these questions, all of these things that we don't always focus on this time of year. We think about the new birth, but what are the things that took place to get there? Unlike those in Isaiah's time, we have more than just the prophecy of Christ coming. We have the records of everything that happened. We also have the future. Wouldn't it be great to be able to see our child's future? Okay, sometimes it'd be nice to see my own future. What's happening next? Mary and Joseph were given a glimpse. They know about what Isaiah said. So they know now, are they putting these two things together? We look and see when the angel talked to Mary, she thought on these things very in depth. She was probably comparing them to the scriptures. Do we equate all these things? Do we remember the occurrence of Jesus' birth as one of the many promises that God has kept, showing his pattern of love for us? The birth of Christ is very important because it was a prediction and it was a prophecy from God. Did he fulfill that prophecy? Did he fulfill the other prophecies that are there? And every single piece has its part. When we have a 1,000-piece puzzle, if you don't put every piece in, the puzzle is not complete. The birth of Christ is one of those pieces. The life of Christ, the death of Christ, the resurrection of Christ. We celebrate that every first day when we partake of the Lord's Supper. When we stop and think about just his birth, it had to happen so that he could live in such a way to glorify God, to be dedicated to his service, to show us how it is to be done, even amidst the struggles that he would have faced in his life. Imagine growing up with the stigma of having been an out-of-wedlock child. Imagine, oh, well, you were just in a manger. You were in the food trough of the barn animals. But yet, do we judge a child by their circumstances or by what they become? What they grow into? Ooh, that's a fussy little baby. That thing's crying all the time. That ain't going, How many of us were fussy when we were a child? It's not about our start all the time. Christ came into this world, lived a godly life, showing us it can be done, and then becoming the sacrifice for us so that we might have salvation. That's what the birth of Christ allows us to have. It is another promise of God fulfilled. It is the pattern of God showing that he loves us that much, that Christ gave up all to come for us. Do we love him enough to give him room in our hearts? To give him our hearts. If we have need of the invitation this day, if we need to make room in our heart so that we can put him here instead of sending him down the road, let's let that need be known. If we're struggling and need assistance, we're here for one another. Let's help one another continue to be joyful, to continue to receive the blessings that God gives us. All we have to do is go and accept them and do what he has said for us to do. If there is need of the invitation, we offer it now while we stand and sing.